Temporal ships. Of all the specializations in Star Trek Online, temporal can be one of the more complicated. It's got a bunch of hidden mechanics that you don't normally see on the other specializations, and it can cause some confusion among the player base on how to run them. So today I'm going to be taking a close look at temporal ships, going over what the ship mechanic does, what the bridge officer seating is good for, and the general disadvantages and advantage of this type of ship. But first, this video is brought to you by the STO Discord. They're a community-run Discord server focusing on the PlayStation side of Star Trek Online with the goal of bringing players together. They're a community full of guides, tutorials, minigames, and like-minded gamers. They also host monthly giveaways, which include prizes for a $10 PSN gift card. So if you're playing Star Trek Online on PlayStation and are wanting to join a larger community of like-minded players, be sure to check them out. You can find them at discord.gg/stocoms, or you can find the link down in the pinned comment. And be sure to tell them I sent you. Anyway, back to the video. Temporal, in my opinion, is probably the most versatile of all the specializations in Star Trek Online. It's really good on pretty much any type of ship, whether it be a science vessel, a cruiser, or an escort. It's really good for supporting damage on multiple different damage types, be it energy weapons, or torpedoes, or EPG. Mostly EPG, but it's still really good for those first two as well. But Temporal is also capable of providing some healing and support as well. Not as much as you would probably get off of like Miracle Worker or Command, but it's doable. But Temporal also has some unique mechanics built into it that can make it kind of confusing. So we're going to be going over those today, starting with the Starship ship mechanic. So this mechanic is called Molecular Reconstruction, and what it does is you've got 3 buttons here, and each of these are different options on how you can fly your ship, basically. Each of these is a different configuration. You've got offensive configuration, defensive configuration, and support configuration. This is part of the reason why Temporal is so versatile, because you've literally got like all 3 options here for builds to help support it one way or another. How it works is you just click one, boom, and it's on. You can some temporal ships will have a little indicator visual on the ship itself. Some of them don't. This is something they started doing when temporal ships were still pretty new, but as the game's gotten older, they kind of forget to make a place for this at some point. So some ships have it, some don't. But either way, you can clearly see it here on the UI. It is selected. I've got offensive configuration right now, which means that I am getting buffs to my maximum engine power, which is a +10 buff, plus 20% to flight speed, and plus 20% to turn rate, which means I'm going to be faster and more maneuverable. But there is also a downside, because I'm also going to be getting a minus 20% to incoming hull healing. So I'm going to be a bit faster, a bit more maneuverable, but I'm also going to be a bit less tanky. And the same is kind of true with the other configurations. Defensive configuration, which, as you would expect, is more defense focused. It gives me a plus 10% to maximum shield power, as well as plus 20% to incoming hull healing. But I take a hit to flight speed and turn rate. So I'm going to be a bit more tanky, but I'm going to be a bit less maneuverable. And then there's the support configuration, which is more focused on sciencey space magic stuff. So I get plus 10 to maximum aux power, plus 20% to exotic damage, plus 40 to control expertise, but I do take a hit to energy weapon damage, getting a minus 16.7% to energy weapon damage. Now, the mechanic goes beyond just simple stat buffs, because there's also this button right here, the Molecular Deconstruction Beam. What this does is, as this builds up, you'll have this progress bar will build up as you're in combat, and this thing will do a variety of different effects onto both you and an enemy target. It'll you target an enemy, and it will fire off a beam that will deal physical damage over time to an enemy. It will also disable them for a certain period of time, as well as provide you with some hull heals over time. Now, the interesting thing about this beam is that how powerful each of these effects will be will depend on which configuration you've been using, because as you're in combat, you will build up these counters depending on which configuration you're in. If you're in offensive configuration, you'll gain offensive counters. If you're in defensive configuration, you'll gain defensive counters, and support. I mean, you get the idea. Support configuration will give support counters. And depending on how many of which counters you'll have will affect how powerful each of these effects on the Molecular Deconstruction Beam will be. So if I've got a bunch of the offensive counters, that will increase the power of the physical damage that this beam does to an enemy. But if I have more support counters in here, that will increase the duration of the disable. And if I have more defensive counters in here, that will increase the strength of the hull heal that it gives to me. One of the interesting things about the temporal specialization is that you can actually mix up these configurations during battle. So you'll gain these counters as you're fighting a battle, but you can switch between them mid-fight. So these will not lock out while you're in combat. So just mid-fight, you can just decide to switch over to defensive, and then you'll start gaining defensive counters. And then say you wanted to switch it up again after this cooldown's done, you can switch over to support afterwards, and you'll still gain counters, and you'll watch them because each counter will be a different color, so you'll have an idea of just how much of each effect you'll be getting for the molecular deconstruction beam when you fire it off. Now, which type of configuration you want to be running is going to depend on which type of build you're running at the time. Like if you're running like a typical energy weapon build, you'll probably be wanting to run offensive configuration, especially if you like moving pretty quickly throughout a TFO or map or anything like that, because this is much more focused around speed and less focused around healing. If you're running some sort of tank build, then obviously you'll want to be running the defensive configuration because that's much more defensive focused. You'll be a bit more sluggish because you'll be taking a bit of a hit to flight speed and turn rate, but it's a tank. That's kind of to be expected with most tank type ships. And then, of course, if you're running the support configuration, you're probably going to be running some sort of sciencey space magic EPG build, because this is doing a bunch to buff your exotic and control abilities and your auxiliary power, all of which feed a lot into your science builds. Though that said, support can also be really valuable on something like a torpedo build, because while the support configuration does give you a debuff to energy weapons, that's not going to be a problem for a torpedo build because you're not going to be running energy weapons on a torpedo build. And the exotic damage can actually be pretty helpful on a torpedo build because there are a lot of extra abilities like chemosite-laced weaponry, and a lot of the torpedoes that you normally use on a torpedo build deal some sort of radiation or other type of exotic damage. So support configuration can still be really helpful with that sort of build as well. So that's the nice thing about support configuration. It can be good for actual support sciencey stuff, or for more offensive based torpedo damage, despite the fact that it's still support configuration. So really, the only time I would actually be using offensive configuration is if I were still running an energy weapon build. So that is the temporal mechanic in a nutshell. Just pick which configuration that you think will best support your build, and then focus on that while you're in combat, and then just fire off the beam when it's off cooldown. Typically, you want to fire this off on like big tanky targets, like a large Borg cube or some sort of battleship. I wouldn't use this on like small little mob ships. You use this for your big heavy targets, especially if you're in offensive or support configuration. Now let's move on to the bridge officer abilities, because there are a few nice things about the bridge officer abilities in Temporal. One of which is that of all the specializations, Temporal has the most number of abilities that will trigger with unconventional systems. If you're unfamiliar with unconventional systems, what it does is every time you activate a certain control ability from your bridge officers, it will reduce the cooldown of your universal consoles, which can be a very powerful thing. I mean, for a long time, unconventional systems has kind of been the thing that will determine just how good a ship can be, because your universal consoles can be just that insanely powerful. So getting their cooldowns that much lower so you can activate them that much more often is a very crucial thing for getting more power out of your ship. Those three abilities are Heisenberg Amplifier, Chronometric Inversion Field, and Timeline Collapse. All three of these will trigger unconventional systems, so they're really nice to have just on your spam bar. They do have some advantages and disadvantages. Like, I know some people do get really annoyed with Heisenberg Amplifier because it's a random teleport, so people who are really focused on flanking damage can find this ability to be rather frustrating. Chronometric doesn't really have any downside, so this one's pretty fine. But the other downside with Timeline Collapse is that it's a higher level ability. So a lot of people probably aren't going to be using this all that often, even if they have the room for it, because, well, there's another ability that's usually more often better in that slot, and that is Recursive Shearing. Recursive Shearing is capable of being a very powerful damage ability. What it does is you use it on a single target, and then it will basically build up damage over time based on how much damage it's taking from other sources. That's from you or from other members on your team. Basically, it'll build up damage that it's taking in from every source on the map, and then it will reapply that damage, or it will reapply a portion of that damage as physical damage over the course of several seconds. So this can be an insanely powerful thing because you're basically just stacking more damage on top of the damage that you're already doing. This ability is extremely powerful in a team setting, like in a TFO or something like that. So this can be a very valuable thing, and especially in like elite TFOs where everyone's just focusing on one target at a time. So recursive shearing can really double down on the damage that you're already doing as a team, one single target, like a tactical cube. In fact, it's so powerful. They've actually had to put several limitations on this thing too, because like you can't stack more than one recursive shearing onto a single target, and you also can't stack recursive shearing along with the agony redistribution off of the adamant heavy raider, because it just becomes insanely powerful when stacked on top of each other. So you can really only use one at a time of these, which that's another reason why some people might not use recursive shearing and might just go with timeline collapse instead, because if too many people are using recursive shearing all at once, then only a few of you are going to actually be able to use the ability. Yeah, that's something to think about right there. Do you want to do the extra damage, or do you think just getting one more unconventional systems trigger will be more valuable to you? So it's going to be kind of a question depending on what sort of environment you're going to be in. Now, before I go over the rest of the Temporal Bridge Officer abilities, I want to go over a certain mechanic that the Temporal Bridge Officer abilities have, and that's called entropy. Actually, this will be easier to explain on the wiki. So, the way temporal abilities work is that they're split into two different categories: entropy builders and entropy consumers. And what entropy does is certain abilities will apply stacks of a certain status effect called entropy. And what entropy will do is certain abilities will consume that entropy that's been built up on certain targets to make that ability more powerful. Channel deconstruction is a good example. This is a really great ability for applying entropy because it will apply one entropy every 2 seconds to your target. That's a lot more than most of the other entropy builders will do. So what it'll do, it'll apply entropy, and then once that entropy is applied, you can go down here to one of the consumer abilities like Timeline Collapse or Rapid Decay or Gravimetric Conversion, and they will consume that entropy to make their effects more powerful. You can build up to 5 stacks of entropy onto a single target, so depending on how much entropy you've gotten onto your enemy is going to depend on just how powerful some of these consumer abilities will be. I've already talked about Timeline Collapse as an ability for triggering unconventional systems, but it's also a pretty decent pull ability, and it will become that much better as a pull ability, and plus it'll also trigger some physical damage over time. But both of those effects will become more improved against targets that have entropy on them. Like I said, channel deconstruction is probably the best for applying entropy to a single target, but there are plenty of other abilities that will apply entropy to different targets. Like Chronometric Conversion Field has a chance to apply entropy to all foes inside its field. Recursive Shearing can apply +2 entropy. Like I said, each of these has their own effects, and they will each apply a certain amount of entropy in their own way. Now, there are 2 abilities in the Temporal Specialization that will go outside the builder and consumer entropy category. That is casual reversion and entropic redistribution. So what entropic redistribution will do is it will remove the entropy from one target and then spread it out among multiple targets that are within 5 kilometers of that primary target that you're targeting right now. So if you're wanting to build up entropy on a lot of targets, but if you're wanting to do it pretty quickly, a good method to do that would be to use channel deconstruction onto one target and then hit them with entropic distribution to spread that entropy around to other targets nearby to that enemy target. This ability can also be useful if you're using casual reversion, which is the only heal in the Temporal Specialization, because it will heal your hull, but that hull heal will become that much more powerful if you are nearby foes that have entropy on them. Now, the big downside with the whole entropy mechanic is that most players are going to mainly focus on just getting the unconventional systems triggers onto their build, and that's about it. Maybe recursive shearing, just because of the sheer power that it's capable of, but the general entropy mechanic is something that's going to be largely ignored just because of how much space it tends to take up. If you're going to be taking advantage of the unconventional systems triggers and then wanting to further take advantage of all of the entropy mechanic, it ends up taking up a lot of real estate within your bridge officer abilities. And it's something that I would probably only recommend doing on something that has more than one temporal seat, something like the Premonition or the Temporal Warships or the legendary Constitution or the legendary Discovery Constitution flight deck carrier. Another thing with the Temporal Specialization bridge officer abilities is that a lot of them end up dealing physical damage. Because any of the ones that deals any type of damage, or even the ones that are basically just meant to be entropy builders, they'll still end up building some sort of physical damage. The thing with physical damage is that it is an exotic form of damage. So it's really good on EPG builds. That's literally what the E in EPG stands for, exotic. So it's the kind of thing that you would want to do on science ships mainly. So that's why that's part of the reason why science and temporal go hand in hand so well so often. But it's not something that you have to do on a science ship. You could still make a lot of this stuff work on a cruiser or an escort, but it's going to be a lot more effective on science ships. But like I said, the really good stuff here is the unconventional systems triggers, as well as recursive shearing. Everything else is just kind of fun stuff to play around with if you really want to play around with the entropy mechanic. So if you have that kind of room in your temporal seating, feel free to go nuts. There's some interesting stuff here with all with an interesting mechanic built into it. So like this temporal is the one that I feel like you can have the most variety in it without having to mix in another specialization into it. So that's one of the reasons why I kind of wish we'd have more like pure, like full double temporal ships, because it's one of the few specializations where that's really not a bad thing to have like a lot of temporal specialization seating. Now, just because temporal is really good on its own doesn't mean it's not really good paired with the other specializations. In fact, just the opposite. Temporal is probably like my more favorite specialization to pair with nearly any of the other specializations. Like this ship, the Temporal Light Cruiser, has a secondary command seat. Command is a really good pairing with temporal because command is actually really weak with unconventional systems triggers, but has some really great support and DPS abilities that can balance with temporal really well. And that's kind of true with all of the other specializations. Temporal is really good at just further enhancing the strengths of the other specializations because of all of the unconventional system triggers that it has. Though you don't have to go all in on the uncon triggers. Like I said, there's the entropy mechanic that you can use to make the other temporal abilities even stronger, and of course there's recursive shearing, which in any situation, in any team situation at least, it always hits like a truck. So that's always nice to have too. But yeah, that's just one more reason why I still say that temporal is the most versatile of the specializations in Star Trek Online. So overall, for the temporal specialization, the pros are that it's very versatile. It's good on pretty much any kind of ship. You can load it up on a science ship and go really all into the temporal abilities with entropy and go really heavy on that physical damage, or you can just focus on the unconventional systems triggers if you're using like a cruiser or an escort. Either way, it's kind of a win-win either way. In my opinion, the only real downside to the temporal specialization is just how the entropy mechanic ends up taking up so much real estate, because you'd have to add so many more temporal abilities to take full advantage of it, and it's just you just end up running out of room, especially if you're wanting to take advantage of those unconventional systems triggers. Like I would have to give up all this command seating in order to swap that out for a temporal seat to really take advantage of some of the temporal abilities. But that's also kind of one of the nice things about that too, is like you can either go all in with temporal if you have double temporal seating, or if you don't have double temporal seating, say you've got like temporal with swap with something else, you're still going to have a good time because you're still going to be able to balance that really effectively. And you can't say that about every specialization. Sometimes you can have, like with command, it's absolutely a thing where you can have too much command seating. And there are also certain specializations that don't mesh well with command, like Miracle Worker. Okay, that statement's kind of debatable. Like there are some pros to pairing up command and Miracle Worker as well, but I feel like there's also some serious drawbacks with it as well. But in the end, that is a topic for another video. Let's get back to talking about temporal. And honestly, I feel like I've kind of gone over everything, so I think we're gonna wrap things up here. But yeah, that about sums up temporal ships in Star Trek Online, the pros, the cons, and everything in between. If you found this guide helpful, be sure to hit the like button, and if you'd like to see more videos about Star Trek Online, be sure to hit subscribe as well so you can get notified every time I upload a new video, because trust me, I talk about Star Trek Online a lot. If you have any questions or comments, you can post those down below as well, and if you'd like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or check out the merch store, or check out the links in the pinned comment, and any of those really help me out, and I really do appreciate it. Either way though, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.